this for people who can't be here, but this is our third in a series of 5 on what does the death of Jesus tell us about him and also about ourselves. So we're looking at all 4 Gospels. We started with Mark, we did Matthew, tonight is Luke, next week will be John. Week 5, we'll pull it all together. We'll do some comparing and contrasting and ask the question of, well, what do we get from all 4 books together? We're not the first people, or I should say people living in the 21st century are not the first people to recognize that the Gospels don't tell the story in exactly the same way, that there are variations or disagreements or inconsistencies among them. We can tell from writings of other people in the ancient church, they were smart enough to realize this as well. But one of the things that's interesting to me about the Gospels is they appear to not have been saved because they were seen as a precise, exact record of exactly what happened, exactly who was there, how many people, what were the exact words Jesus said. That for the most part, the Gospels are similar to an ancient biography, and that their most important, I guess, agenda or purpose is to try to capture something of the character of the person that they're talking about. So they're trying to help us not just see what exactly did Jesus do, but that their bigger interest is what kind of a person was Jesus? What kind of things did he do? And of course, the gospel authors, they're writing probably 40, maybe as long as 70 years after the life of Jesus. And so they're drawing from traditions. They're perhaps writing things that they think characterize him well. They're not doing history like we might do with, putting a microphone in front of somebody's mouth or hiring a stenographer, to give us exact words. They're giving us memories of Jesus. They're telling us a lot about how Christians near the end of the 1st century remembered who Jesus was. If the most important thing for your faith is, I want to know exactly what Jesus said when he climbed a mountain and gave a sermon, I want to know exactly what he said when he died, the Gospels are going to constantly lead us into, not confusion, but they're going to lead us into the inability to make a firm decision about that. I think that's okay if the purpose of the Gospels is to build faith and to prompt conversations about what kind of person was Jesus, why do we think he was important? If our ultimate goal is to figure out exactly what happened, we don't have as many sources as we perhaps might like to have. But I'm happy to talk about that more with people too, if you want to, down the road. But I'm gonna dive into Luke now. And I was thinking about this as I was preparing for tonight, that in some ways this is a little goofy to try to do, all of Mark's passion narrative, and now tonight all of Luke's passion narrative in one night, because there's really a lot there. And for those of you who have read in advance, I asked you to look for things that are distinctive or particular or unique about each gospel. And there's really so many. So I recognize that we're going fast and we're flying at a high altitude over the gospel stories. So I ask you to bear with me in terms of doing that, but also to recognize that we can still learn a lot and see a lot. So I'm going to do some summarizing tonight, as I've done before. I want to start by sharing my screen and highlighting a couple of things that I think are important for how we think about the gospel according to Luke. And to do that, I want to start with a bit of background. Remember our very first week, I talked about what kind of a death crucifixion was in the ancient world. Last week when we did Matthew, I talked about the ways in which the chief priests were in many ways collaborators with the Roman government, not necessarily in a way that, sacrificed all of their integrity, but it was a kind of collaboration based on need. They wanted to continue to run the temple. The Romans wanted good order in the region, and the chief priests were willing to do that. Tonight, I want to talk about the ways in which the gospel according to Luke is really invested in describing Jesus as a Messiah, of course, but a Messiah who is very much like a prophet. Each of the four gospels characterizes Jesus in distinctive ways. They all describe him as a healer. They all describe him as a teacher. Three of them describe him as an exorcist, but they also kind of emphasize certain dimensions of who he was. Matthew's gospel really focuses on the teaching ministry of Jesus and his insights as a teacher. When it comes to Luke, Jesus bears a lot in common with the prophets that we read about in the Old Testament. Or another way of putting this is the author of the gospel according to Luke, I think, wanted us to see Jesus through the lens of the ancient prophets, saw there were ways in which the ministry of Jesus looked like the prophets of old. Now, the prophets in the Old Testament did a lot of things. One of the things they do pretty consistently is call attention to the plight of people who suffer. They talk a lot about justice. They do a lot to criticize the leadership about the ways in which they are falling short of what God's desires for a good society might look like. And so it seems the author of the gospel, according to Luke, kind of saw Jesus as a prophet-like figure, or wanted us to see him as a prophet-like figure. And so the things that the prophets said, but also the kind of rejection the prophets suffered, they tended to be mocked, they tended to be ignored quite a bit. That seems to be a template for understanding Jesus as Luke presents him. So what does that look like in practice? If we had more time, I would show you in some places the gospel according to Luke goes out of its way to compare Jesus to, say, Elijah or Elisha, two of the great prophets of the Old Testament. Jesus' first sermon in the gospel according to Luke is where he quotes the prophet Isaiah and describes himself as having fulfilled Isaiah's vision or Isaiah's words. There's some other places in Luke that are important to look at. In two different places, he talks about Jerusalem and what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. And he sounds a lot like a prophet. One is in Luke 13, where Jesus says, it's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Then he addresses the city itself from a distance. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. A couple of things here, just to notice the way in which Jesus characterizes the whole city as a city that's hostile to prophets, or a city that rejects prophets. And he speaks about the city with a sense of lament. We see this in some of the prophetic writings where the prophets will deliver oracles against cities and will lament what's going to happen to whole cities. So there's ways in which Jesus sounds a bit like them. Also in chapter 19, this is just as he's approaching Jerusalem, he's going to enter the city for Passover, and that's where the story will end. In Luke 19, we're told this: as he came near and saw the city, he wept over it. We see this in other prophetic writings, right? Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, weeps over Jerusalem. But Jesus did this, and he said, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. Notice what's going on here. He's addressing the city. I mean, the people who live in the city, but he's also addressing the city as if he's talking about almost the buildings, right? They won't leave within you one stone upon another. He's describing a time of destruction to come. This is really interesting. I mean, Jesus comes to Jerusalem roughly around the year 30 in the Common Era. And Luke describes him at that time as lamenting the city, as kind of accusing the city of not having recognized this moment of visitation, and talking about a time to come when the city will be under siege and will be destroyed. That happened in the year 70. So about 40 years after the death of Jesus, Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans after a 4-year-long revolt. And Jesus describes the destruction of the city in ways that sound pretty familiar to how some of the contemporary authors describe the destruction of the city at the hands of the Romans. Luke's gospel, we don't know exactly when it was written, probably around the year 85 or 90. So Luke is written after Jerusalem has been destroyed. So there's probably some blurring of history here. In other words, Luke is describing Jesus as lamenting the destruction of the city, but Luke is also writing during a time where Luke knows that the city was destroyed and knows something about it. But also notice here the ways in which Jesus kind of treats Jerusalem as a character or as a city that has a will. That's always a difficult thing to do. I mean, if you want to ask people, what's the mood in Minneapolis tonight? That's the answer is probably, well, it depends, right? Who we're talking about. But here Jesus speaks about the city as a kind of singular mind almost. So just to note this, that when he comes to Jerusalem, he's already talked about ways in which the city is going to miss the point, or ways in which the city is going to reject him as a prophet. I think we'll see why that's important when we get to what's going on in Luke's description of Jesus' death. For the most part, the plot follows a pretty similar trajectory to what we see in both Mark and in Matthew. But here are some of the distinctive things that we see in Luke's gospel. I'll go kind of quickly through these. I apologize about that, but take notes or feel free to go back to your Bible. Make sure you check my work. In Luke 22, the gospel says that Satan enters into Judas Iscariot. That's significant. In Matthew and in Mark, we don't have a sense of what motivates Judas exactly. We're not told what his motive is. But here in Luke, we're told that something about this is satanic, or Judas is somehow motivated by evil motives, which is, on the one hand, chilling, on the other hand, probably calls for some explanation. After Jesus has his last meal with his followers, he says this, that Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat. In other words, he tells his disciples that this is a dangerous time for them, that something is going on beyond the political ordeal. I think I mentioned this back when we did the Gospel of Mark 2 weeks ago. Mark presents the story as in very much like a political drama, right? We see the human beings who are involved, we see the injustice involved, we see the suffering involved. Luke kind of opens a crack in the door and says there's more going on here than just human beings at work. There's something as well spiritual taking place. In other words, Luke sees this as a kind of spiritual drama as well as a political drama. Jesus instructs his disciples about things like purses, bags, and swords. He tells them things like, make sure you have a purse, right? Get a bag. If you don't have a sword, sell something and buy a sword. Back in chapter 10, verse 4, when he sent his disciples out on a preaching mission, he said, don't bring a purse, don't bring a bag. But now he's saying, basically gird yourselves for action, right? Get ready to travel, get ready to run, get ready to have to defend yourself, or get ready for conflict. It's a very different mood. We get a sense of the stakes being high with those comments. Jesus says as well in Luke's gospel that he must be counted among the lawless. And he quotes from Isaiah 53, verse 12 with that line, suggesting that there's some kind of purpose playing itself out. When they get to the Mount of Olives, or what some gospels refer to as Gethsemane, where Jesus prays just before his arrest, in Matthew and in Mark, the disciples fall asleep because they're kind of losers, or they just kind of they're not up for the moment. But in Luke's gospel, there's this interesting line that says that they fall asleep because of grief. In other words, Luke kind of gives an explanation or kind of gives an excuse for why the disciples can't handle the moment, which is interesting, right? Luke seems to be extending a little bit of grace toward the disciples, or perhaps suggesting that the spiritual conflict taking place is just too much, that somehow they're overwhelmed by the moment. When Jesus is arrested, somebody slices off the ear of one of the slaves of one of the high priests, and Luke describes Jesus as healing the man's ear. It's one of these peculiar details in Luke's gospel, that it's not just enough that there's some violence around the arrest, but Jesus is, bringing wholeness, right? He's still healing even as he is in the custody of the forces that seize him. More things that take place. The hearing before the temple leaders. In Matthew and in Mark, it happens at night. Luke describes it as happening early in the morning and describes it in a very abbreviated way. It's very, very short. Then Jesus goes to Pilate, or the temple leaders bring Jesus before Pilate. Pilate doesn't spend a lot of time with Jesus, but he then sends him off to Herod. This isn't Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the Jewish king, so to speak, who ruled at Rome's behest. He died when Jesus was very young, but Herod Antipas, one of his sons, was the kind of the Jewish king over Galilee. He was under Roman authority, but he ruled. And we're told that Pilate sends Jesus off to Herod Antipas, who kind of mocks Jesus, kind of has some sport with him, and Jesus doesn't want to answer his questions. Then there's this weird line that when Jesus returns to Pilate, that Luke tells us that same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. It's just a weird line that something about the prosecution of Jesus reconciles Herod and Pilate. It might be that Jesus is even still making peace between peoples, even as he himself is the one who's, in custody and about to be crucified and all of this. It's just this odd detail that Luke includes in verse 12 of chapter 23. When Jesus goes to the cross, he's not alone. In Luke's gospel, we're told that this is in verse 27 of chapter 23. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." And then he goes on to say, basically, things are going to get worse. He's right. He says, if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when the wood is dry, right? In other words, things are going to get more dangerous as time goes on. But only in Luke's gospel do we have Jesus now consoling the people who are in despair as he goes to his crucifixion. I mentioned the last 2 weeks that both Matthew and Mark describe none of Jesus' friends being present with him at the crucifixion. In Luke's gospel, though, there are people there who are bemoaning his death and who, after he dies, leave lamenting his death. Only Luke's gospel has one of the criminals crucified with him who reaches out to Jesus and says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Even on the cross, Jesus is still dispensing salvation to other people. When Jesus dies, and this is the question that Jane put forth at the beginning, his words are not, my God, why have you forsaken me?" They are, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," which is a quotation from Psalm 31, verse 5. And then the last detail to notice here is the centurion, the Roman centurion. In Matthew and Mark, he says, "Surely this person was the Son of God." In Luke's gospel, he says, "Surely this man was innocent," or "Surely this man was righteous." So slightly different. If it was innocent, it's kind of, even the centurion realizes that this has been a perversion of justice, right? Somehow an innocent person went to his death. That's a lot of details. Again, Matthew and Mark are very similar in the story that they tell. Luke starts to kind of expand that story, or has a variety of other details that get added in, to Luke's gospel. Let me pause there. That was a lot. I wanted to slow down and see if there's any questions or things that people see that deserve more attention or anything like that about what makes Luke distinctive. Perhaps you hear some details that you've heard before, right? Maybe remember me when you come into your kingdom, and today you'll be with me in paradise. Only in Luke's gospel. That's really helpful if you're ever on Jeopardy, and one of the categories is Bible trivia. But more importantly, I think it helps us see ways in which Luke's gospel is characterizing the death of Jesus as not a scene of utter hopelessness, but as a time when Jesus still continues to be the source of divine salvation in Luke's point of view. So, Jerome, you unmuted. Do you have something you were going to say?
Yeah, My Bible does not have verse 43 or verse 44, and it says that was probably not included with the original gospel, but added later. Is there anything to say about that part?
With verse 43?
43 and 44 about the angel giving him strength.
Oh, and I'm sorry, the other chapter.
Yeah, chapter
Um,
22, right.
sorry. Yes. So there are a couple of details in Luke's gospel that, depending upon what Bible version you're reading, might have marks around them. So in the New Revised Standard Version, they have double brackets. So in chapter 22, verses 43 and 44, then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Also in chapter 23, verse 34, when Jesus is being crucified, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." So some versions have those verses, some do not. If you have a King James version, they probably don't. I'm sorry, they probably do. Other versions don't. What's going on there is the surviving Greek manuscripts that we have from the ancient world, roughly 4th century till about like 7th century. Some of those documents include those sayings and some don't, which just means that there's disagreement in the sources about whether those were original parts of Luke's gospel or whether they might have been added at a later time. The evidence on that, I think, is split just about 50-50. In other words, most Bible scholars really can't agree about whether or not those words were an original part of Luke's gospel or whether they might have been added later by somebody trying to supplement the story. I'll just leave it at that. I mean, these problems show up in a variety of places in the New Testament where the Greek manuscripts that we have from the ancient world don't agree 100% across the board. What's interesting is that those are pretty dramatic verses, right? That the one in chapter 22 about, sweating and his sweat being like drops of blood, we have a sense of the intensity of his prayer in the garden. And then that line, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing," is, an act of pretty utter generosity or graciousness, right? As Jesus is being executed there. Does that help, Jerome, or you want to dig deeper into the kind of the meaning of those two things?
Well,
Or
no, that's okay. I did want to ask about now you said this was written about 85 or 90 BCE. Uh, were there, do you think, other versions or sources that were maybe written earlier? And maybe when Jerusalem was destroyed, maybe that was too, or why did they start writing them at that time? They
sure.
were around about the same time, weren't they? The Gospels.
Yeah. Here's what we know for sure. We've got we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are other gospels that have survived from the ancient world. One called the Gospel of Thomas, and there's debates about the dating of the Gospel of Thomas. I think it's probably 2nd century. It's probably around the years 140 to 150. There's another gospel called the Gospel of Peter that has only survived in fragments. In other words, the whole book didn't make it. And there's debates about when to date that as well. So we know there were other biographies or memorials of Jesus that were written down. We just don't know how many exactly. In Luke's gospel, like the very first 4 verses of Luke's gospel, the author explains that he was aware of other documents, other memories of Jesus, other stories about Jesus, but he decided to write one on his own and talks about having done research into it. So that tells us that whoever the author was, and he says he was not an eyewitness, he was not among Jesus' followers, but he knows there were other gospels already in circulation. and it seems like he thinks he can do better, or he can tell the story better, or he's got an angle on the story that he wants to tell. I think it's almost certain that the author of Luke used the Gospel of Mark as a source. There's just so much agreement, sometimes just word for word agreement. There's also a lot of widespread agreement that the person who wrote Luke probably had access to another writing that the author of Matthew also had. This other writing has not survived, it doesn't exist, or if it does, we've not dug it up. And parts of Luke as well probably come from other sources, and part of it probably was the author's own composition as well, perhaps, in some stories, or perhaps linking some stories. All that work is pretty speculative, but I think it is pretty well agreed upon that Luke wasn't an author who just sat down and wrote from scratch, but that Luke was in many ways kind of an editor who was drawing upon other traditions that were in circulation. Luke certainly gives it a kind of arrangement or a kind of final form, has control over it, like an author would, but a lot of these stories are probably inherited, if that makes sense. Oh, you asked, how come nobody had written it down until then? We have no idea. One possibility is because Christians thought the world was going to end before they were going to die, that the first generation of Christians thought that Jesus would come back at any time. That's a disincentive to writing if you think that you've only got a few days left. It could be that. It could be that as the first generation of Jesus followers start to die out, that the next generation thinks we've got to create documents, right? We have to create a more, I don't know, secure or permanent way of remembering things, or perhaps it's because there's disputes in Christian circles about what's the right way to remember who Jesus was, and certain people who are literate kind of step into that gap and write the story the way they think the story should be told. What is more clear, I think, is that Christians in the first decade or two after Jesus don't seem to think that writing text is a main priority. Do you know what I mean? We just don't, if anybody did write anything down right away, we just have no connection to it. The Apostle Paul's earliest letters are probably around the year 50, so that's still a good 20-year gap. All right, that's like New Testament emerging history 101, which is, I could talk about that all night too, but I think I'll move on. I think I'll go back to Luke. How about that? All right, I see no objections. So I'm going to go back to sharing the screen here and say a little bit more about some of the details then. So here's some of the details, distinctive aspects in Luke's account. Well, so what is maybe your next question. What might Luke be urging us to see, or what are some of the important details of the crucifixion according to Luke? And again, go back to Luke 22 and 23 and check my work on this. But I would say a couple of points. One is that other than Jesus, everybody involved seems to come across as overwhelmed in some way, shape, or form. The disciples are told that Satan has demanded to sift them like wheat. They fall asleep because of grief. Even Pilate, in some ways, is a little bit overwhelmed. In Luke 23, Luke describes Pilate as wanting to release Jesus, but the crowd prevails over him, which is peculiar. It's hard to imagine how the Roman governor in the region would be overwhelmed by the crowd. But Pilate appears just kind of not able to control the setting when he's issuing the death sentence against Jesus. There's a lot of confusion that permeates the trial. Luke doesn't tell us about false witnesses like both Mark and Matthew did, but rather the chief priest simply asked Jesus one question, and he says, you say that I am. And they say, well, we don't need more testimony. We've heard it from his own lips. And they bring Jesus then to Pilate. Then Pilate sloughs Jesus off on Herod. Pilate says, well, this guy's from Galilee. I'm going to let Herod handle it. And Herod can't figure anything out. So Herod sends him back to Pilate. Only in Luke do we have this back and forth where Jesus is kind of shuttled between different politicians to have his verdict delivered. Nobody seems to quite know what to do with him or how to get rid of him. There's an accent on the innocence of Jesus, that he's undeserving of this. In some ways, Pilate emphasizes that in chapter 23. When the centurion says, certainly this man was innocent, that also seems to be an accent on this, as if Luke wants to see this as kind of the tragic story of the death of a person that everybody seems to know was innocent, but nobody was able to, to put a wedge in the gears and stop it. A couple other details that Luke might want us to see. In some ways, all of Jerusalem bears some responsibility for this. What do I mean by that? When Pilate sentences Jesus to death in Luke, this is in chapter 23, verse 13. I don't have this text on the slide, I'm sorry. But it says this, that Pilate calls together the chief priests, the leaders. That would make sense. This is a small group of the elite of the Jewish ruling class. But Pilate also assembles the people, which would be odd. Why would Pilate want to call kind of rank and file people? But he does, according to Luke. He says, you brought me this man as one who is perverting the people. I've examined him. I don't think he's guilty. Herod doesn't think he's guilty. And then just jump down to verse 23, after Pilate says he wants to have him released. In verse 23, they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. It's an interesting way of putting it, right? Pilate's verdict is, yes, I'll do what the people of Jerusalem say. And then verse 26, as they led him away, well, the they there is ambiguous. It's almost as if Luke is saying that it's the people who led him away, which certainly wouldn't have been the case. They wouldn't have had the authority to crucify Jesus. But it's this weird kind of sense of the crowd that seized control of the moment. Then to jump down a little bit further, when Jesus is being crucified, it's the mood becomes different. So look at verse 34 of chapter 23. Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And verse 35, and the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, he saved others. Let him save himself if he's the Messiah of God, his chosen one. And the soldiers mocked him as well. So the people have this role in calling for Jesus' death. But once it comes time for the crucifixion, Luke starts to say, well, the people stood by watching and the leaders were mocking him. In other words, Luke starts to distinguish between the folks, the common folk, the people, and the leaders on the other hand. When Jesus dies, this is verse 48, when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their breasts, just a symbol of lament, right, or of grief from what they've seen. So it's interesting that on the one hand, Luke wants to say that the people of Jerusalem somehow have a responsibility in Jesus' death. But when it comes time for Jesus to be crucified, Luke does start to distinguish between the people and the leaders. And the leaders seem to be pretty sure this is the right thing to do. They spend time mocking Jesus. But the people are lamenting throughout this. Historically, what was going on? That's a great question. Hard to tell. But certainly it wouldn't have been the people who would have decided this entirely, right? For somebody to be crucified, there would have had to have been some kind of Roman consent to what's going on. But it's as if Luke wants to, in a sense, at least just for a moment, suggest that all of Jerusalem somehow bears some responsibility for this. Why would Luke say that? That could be an anti-Jewish sentiment on Luke's part. That could be Luke's way of saying, you know what, the reason the city was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era is because Jerusalem rejected Jesus as their Messiah back in 30, right? Good riddance to them. I'm not certain that that's exactly what Luke is doing here, but I do think that Luke wants us to see Jerusalem in some ways as a whole as rejecting Jesus, or at least failing to stand up for Jesus. Why is that? Go back to those earlier statements that I showed you about how it's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. or for Jesus to say, lamenting that the city has missed its moment of visitation. Something about the way in which Luke describes Jesus as a prophet seems to suggest for Luke that what happens to prophets is they're rejected by the people to whom they are sent. So there's a way in which Luke kind of wants to widen the sense of responsibility, that it's not just about the leaders opposing Jesus, but it's a little bit, more widely shared. We can talk about that in a bit. I want to highlight Jesus' faithfulness unto death. Again, he says, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Very generous. When one of the people crucified alongside of him says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And then when it's time to die, he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, right? An expression of faithfulness, an expression of trust there at the very end. In many ways in Luke, Jesus dies like a faithful martyr, right? Somebody who has been brought to death in an unjust way and yet dies with faithfulness and dies with dignity and a kind of confidence. Despite the rejection, Jesus is still saving, still being followed, and still mourned. In other words, he's still promising salvation to the criminal who's crucified with him. He still has followers who are there, who are with him, who are watching, that he's consoling. And when he dies, there are still mourners. So the alienation or the rejection that we saw, the isolation in Matthew and in Mark, really absent from Luke. Luke sees this as more of a kind of a communal space and a space in which different people respond to Jesus' death in different ways. If I can cheat a little bit and move to the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles is essentially part 2 of Luke's gospel. In the book of Acts, in the early chapters, when the apostles are preaching after the day of Pentecost, there's a lot of emphasis in there about the ways in which the crucifixion is supposed to prompt repentance. It's as if Luke's gospel wants us to say, experience the crucifixion, see how Jesus was rejected, and the proper response to that is repentance. For Jesus' own part, he proves faithful to the end. And then the last thing I would say, there's perhaps some hints of an underlying plan or purpose here. The consolation Jesus gives to his followers at the Last Supper, the consolation he gives to the people who are mourning him as he walks to the cross. I would say that these are some of the things that Luke urges us to see or to recognize in the gospel. Last slide here, a couple of things in terms of summing up. I would say that in Luke, Jesus certainly dies as a victim. In other words, he is not really in control of the circumstances, that he is victimized by the circumstances. He's put to death by a legal system, to use that expression, that doesn't know what to do with him. In many ways, he's a casualty of people's confusion or just their downright indifference. Pilate doesn't spend a lot of time interrogating him in Luke's gospel, and injustice in there. He certainly suffers ignominy and degradation. This comes with being crucified. But through it all, he doesn't relinquish his faith or doesn't relinquish his confidence in God and in God's plan. In many ways, he dies as a rejected prophet in Luke's gospel. He also dies as a king. Pilate asks him about, are you a king? The language of king of the Jews is very important in Luke's gospel. He dies as the savior. He also dies as a son who trusts in his father to tend for his spirit at his death. That's a lot, but I wanted to make sure I didn't run past 8 o'clock tonight. Hopefully you see some of this. If this just feels like a tidal wave of details washing over you, let's spend some time to sort some of that out. But are there things you want to lift up in terms of what makes Luke distinctive here, what some of these details are in Luke's gospel that we haven't seen before in some of the others? Next week when we get to John, it'll be quite different, right? John's kind of in its own universe out there in terms of how John describes things. But what do you see? Go ahead and unmute. I see Brent's hand.
I have often heard Luke referred to as a doctor. I'm curious where that comes from and how, if at all, that sort of manifests itself in the story from his perspective.
Yeah, traditionally Luke has been remembered as a doctor, the author of the gospel. You might see like St. Luke the physician in some towns and things like that for churches. That's there's a Luke mentioned in Colossians chapter 4, and also I think in 2 Timothy, if I'm remembering this correctly. The gospel itself never includes the word Luke. The author never introduces himself. But around the year, I think the earliest we see this is around the year 180, where another Christian author refers to this gospel as the gospel according to Luke. And what the wider church does then is they hear Luke and they quickly jump to the other Luke mentioned in the New Testament, this companion of Paul. And in Colossians chapter 4, there's a Luke who's described or just mentioned as a good physician. And so that's where the tradition comes from. Do we know that that's the same Luke or the same person who wrote the gospel? That depends on how much you trust second century Christian authors. I'm not saying there's no reason not to trust them. I tend to be skeptical of those kinds of things because I think more proof is always better than less proof. And so I kind of am slow to draw strong conclusions. But I can say that as far back as the 2nd century, the church has assigned this gospel to somebody named Luke, who was friends with the Apostle Paul and who might have been named as a physician. Does that play itself out in the gospel? It really doesn't. Sometimes you'll see like Bible study material that says, oh, this gospel more than any other is concerned about medical issues or about healing. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that stands up to the other gospels. There's no specialized vocabulary, for example, in here that like only a physician would have known or something like that. That helps. So not to spoil your, this is what Bible scholars do, right? We tell people the stuff they learned once was maybe not true, but maybe some of it was true. Anyway, was Luke a physician? I have no idea, but that's the tradition.
You know,
yeah, Dwayne.
no.
Oh, someone else. Holly.
Yeah.
Then Dwayne.
You know, Mark seems so much more bleak.
I agree.
You're telling. And this one, you know, did Jesus know that he was going to resurrect? He seems to know his Father's plan. You know, it seems to make the passion a little softer than in Mark. Mark is incredibly bleak. He is up there, he is alone. Everybody's deserted him. This seems much softer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did he
I
know?
agree. I mean, I do.
Did he know he was
I agree that.
Well, go ahead.
This was not the end. Yeah, no, that's all right. That's the nature of Zoom. All 4 gospels have Jesus describing in advance his death and resurrection. Does that mean he knew exactly what was going to happen? It could. It could also mean the gospel authors really wanted to make sure that we didn't think that Jesus was somehow taken by surprise or somehow overwhelmed. You know, I don't know. But it's also true that all of the gospels describe his final moments before the arrest as agonizing. I mean, the prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane or on the Mount of Olives. Jesus says things like basically, you know, let this, well, in other gospels, let this cup pass from me, right? He's not, or he does it in Luke too, but not my will, but yours. I mean, whether Jesus knows what's going to happen or not, he still would really rather this not happen. The Gospels are pretty clear about that. I think it's pretty clear he knows he's going to be arrested. He knows he's probably going to be killed. He knows it probably will not be pretty. And so
that's all pretty logical. I mean, that all makes sense. Avoid that.
Yeah.
And I presume, you know, from birth, his whole mission is, you know, to die. I mean, God kills them, doesn't he? I mean, in the final.
Well, that's one of the questions. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's one of the questions. Sorry, I keep talking over you.
yeah, no, I'm just saying, I mean, in the final analysis, doesn't God kill him in order to, reunite God with humanity, with, with the human being, with the earth, with, I mean, the whole thing. I mean, I thought, God actually kills Jesus. He's born to die.
Yeah, this is one of the questions Christian theology always has to answer, that we have to ask, I think, is his death the purpose of his whole life?
Yes.
I think the answer to that is probably not, just because he does plenty of other things. I don't think the Gospels are wasting pages by talking about the other things he does. At the same time, the Gospels all see his death as a defining moment, right? As somehow the most important part of the story. A lot of Christian theology has said, well, that's because at his death, that's where sins get forgiven. That's where a sacrifice gets made. I'm among the people who gets worried about those kinds of theologies, that God needs, innocent blood to be shed in order to forgive sins. I think the death of Jesus probably means more than just God needs a sacrifice or God needs a dead body. But also, like you said, in all of the Gospels, there is a sense that this is somehow the divine will, that Jesus go through this. So this is the question that we have to reckon with. Does that mean that God wills this? Is this an instance of some kind of child abuse, right? Of a father sacrificing his son, this is why the Abraham story is so evocative to a lot of Christians.
But you can't look at Christ without looking at the Old Testament.
Correct. And that Abraham story seems to be something that a lot of Christian authors in the early church thought was a helpful way of understanding what was happening here. That what looks like something horrific from one angle becomes then a better story at the end. I'm not sure Isaac would agree with that. I imagine Isaac had some trauma to live with in his life, but that's part of it. You can read the stories in a variety of ways. You can read the stories as this was God's will. God demanded this of Jesus. Jesus' feelings or preferences didn't matter. This had to happen for the sake of the whole world.
Right.
That's one way of reading it. I worry that characterizes God as potentially, if not abusive, at least a little bit kind of penned in by some kind of rule. I mean, like, can't God just forgive out of God, the cleanness of God's own heart, or the purity of God?
This allows God to have a personal relationship with everybody, and in Judaism it is exclusive. This bursts open God's relationship to everyone.
That is part of it. That there's this sense that the tearing of the curtain in the temple, that this somehow becomes a moment where the world is set on a new course, where there is a new openness to people's connection with God. That's
and we go from God to the Trinity on top of it.
It is.
How much more?
This is one of the places where, like, the Trinity makes my head hurt, trying to distinguish between these things. If Jesus himself is divine, if Jesus himself is God, then that becomes interesting to think about God undergoing death or undergoing humiliation, undergoing this horrific, that when we talk about God having solidarity with humanity, that God chooses to do that, not by ruling alongside of a king, but by suffering this horrible death alongside somebody else. That becomes an interesting, I think, well, interesting is the wrong word. That becomes a provocative way of talking about the Christian understanding of who God is. Right? That God's means of connecting with humanity isn't about power over us, but is about entering into the human condition at a level that none of us would ever want to experience, or even want to have to see anybody we know experience, right? But we know happens all the time, or know happens pretty regularly, right? That we treat certain members of the human family as expendable, and that's where God chooses to show up. I think that's part of how I find this story empowering, I guess, or inspiring.
Mhm.
Right? There's no place that's absent from that where God's presence is absent, and there's no experience one could go through that God doesn't have a kind of real lived sympathy for.
Right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a.
Yeah, those are the $1 million questions, Holly. Those are.
Mm.
Well, it's almost as if we have to have a death or something dramatic like that to create a new religion. To create followers, create a movement. Sort of like when Martin Luther King was killed, that created a better movement than if he just stayed alive, probably.
You might
Sometimes we have to
disagree.
sacrifice.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about this some more in the 5th week. And some of you might have been taught this or might think this, and this is there in some Christian circles, and C.S. Lewis sold a lot of books with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, to do this, right? That there has to be an innocent victim in order for God to forgive. In some ways, that's attractive to our accounting ways of thinking. But I do worry sometimes that it can paint God into a corner in some unhelpful ways as well. So I would note, throughout the Gospel of Luke, he forgives people's sins just in his lifetime, or he announces things like, that salvation is here, is present where he is. I think from Luke, and this is again, we would need a lot of time to talk about Luke. I think from Luke's perspective, the saving moment is when Jesus is born. That's the moment of good news for humanity, more so than the death. But the death becomes the means by which the promise of resurrection is made plain, and then eventually ends up in the pouring out of the Holy Spirit on all flesh, and so on and so forth. I'm covering a lot of ground there in a hurry, I realize, but thanks for the question, though, Holly. Dwayne, you were going to say something, weren't you?
Well, you've had so much more rich to say, and it's almost 8 o'clock. I was going to just go the other way about it's speculation to find something unique about Luke to color this gospel. But I was thinking, what about the community that produces Luke, so to speak, and the fact that this gospel is attached with another New Testament writing, which none of the other synoptics are, the book of Acts. Is there some motif, maybe would be the way to put it? Is there something moving in this direction that would be worth noticing? We've noticed a lot, so I kind of hesitate to ask my question.
Yeah, let me just say this. So yeah, as far as we know, the only gospel author who wrote a sequel is Luke, so the book of Acts, same author. So we've got that. The book of Acts, in some ways, I think is helpful for helping us make sense of Luke, because a lot of the book of Acts is made up of speeches or sermons that the members of the early church give, talking about the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. And so Acts shows us in some ways, how is this death being interpreted? I mean, none of the Gospels give us a lot of pages explaining this is why Jesus had to die, and this is why it's good news for you, or this is what it does in the world. The book of Acts, though, does give us people, standing up in public saying things like, Jesus was crucified because of the ignorance of the leadership, and we all need to repent and recognize that was God's Messiah. And I mean, that they talk about things like that, or they say things like, Jesus, although he died, God raised him from the dead, and this is how we know resurrection is a real thing. And you know what I mean? That Acts gives us commentaries on the gospel, so to speak, which can be helpful. But you add those together with Luke and Acts, you've got a quarter of the New Testament right there. So that's, I mean, this is an author who made a significant contribution to our Bible. Let me look at this. 8:01. I'm finally close to hitting the 8 o'clock mark. I do have some questions, some small group questions for us. They're in the chat, or if you prefer a separate link, I've got that there. If you click on that link, it'll pull up the 3 questions. So the first one is, as you consider the death of Jesus, are you moved by the idea that his death has a way of indicting all humanity, right? The way in which Luke's gospel, in a sense, holds Jerusalem accountable or responsible for this. Is that part of your experience? Or like when you go through like a Good Friday service, for example, do you view the death of Jesus as something somebody else did, or do you view it as something that we all have some responsibility for? I imagine there are different views on that. Luke emphasizes Jesus' faithfulness and his trust in God even as he dies. In what ways is that a compelling or inspiring part of the story for you? In some ways, Holly mentioned that, right? This is a less raw or less dismal account. And then the third one, this is kind of more contemporary. How does the story of Jesus' death sit with you these days, especially as right now we stand near both the 1-year anniversary of COVID-19 being declared a pandemic and the beginning of the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis. So yeah, 2 ways in which we're reminded of death being in the air and kind of part of our lives. So I'm just kind of curious if there's conversation about that.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I'll break us into small groups if you're
Right.
willing for that to happen.
Mhm.
If you have to run, some of you are leaving, that's fine. We'll see you next week, but hopefully you'll stick around.